Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to explore another literary masterpiece.
Always ready to dive in, especially with the one I got lined up today.
Today we're taking on Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Seems simple enough on the surface, right? An old fisherman, a big fish.
You'd said so, but trust me, there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface. A real iceberg situation, if you will.
Exactly. And luckily, we've got a whole boatload of criticism to help us navigate those depths. We're going to uncover some surprising meanings and maybe even challenge a few assumptions along the way.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at everything from Hemingway's super tight writing style to the deeper themes he was wrestling with, some pretty interesting psychological interpretations of the main character, Santiago.
Oh yeah, those are fascinating.
We'll even touch on connections to Taoism and the structure of those classic Greek tragedies.
That's what I love about these deep dives. You never know where we're going to end up. But that's part of the fun.
Definitely. And for you listening, it's a chance to see how a relatively short novel can spark so much discussion and analysis.
And more importantly, how all these different viewpoints can make your own reading of the book even richer.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with Hemingway himself. The man, the myth, the legend. And his legendary writing style.
Yeah, Hemingway was all about stripping things down to the bare minimum, like cutting out every single word that wasn't absolute necessary.
No fluff allowed.
Nope, none. He wanted his writing to hit you like a punch, right in the gut, to make the experience feel real, like it was happening to you.
He thought The Old Man and the Sea was a success in that regard.
He did. He really felt like he nailed it with this one, partly because he was focusing on what he called a good man and a good boy and the power of the ocean. He thought those were timeless themes that would resonate with everyone.
It's interesting, though, because he moved away from that first-person narration that he was known for in his earlier work.
Right. He shifted gears to third person with The Old Man and the Sea, and the critics definitely noticed.
So he was stepping outside of his comfort zone a bit. Was it a challenge for him?
It was a deliberate choice for sure. It gave him a broader canvas to work with, more viewpoints, more settings, more possibilities. But yeah, it also meant he had to really work hard to keep the narrative tight and focused.
He didn't just jump into it blindly, though.
Oh, no, not at all. He'd been experimenting with this third-person stuff for a while. You see it in Death in the Afternoon. And in some of his longer short stories, like The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber and The Snows of Kilimanjaro.
Those are classics.
Definitely. Those stories were like his training ground for The Old Man and the Sea. He honed his craft there, figuring out how to make that third-person perspective really work for him.
I think you wonder what the book would have been like if he'd gone in a different direction. I read that he considered including a whole bunch of other characters and going into a lot more detail about the village life.
Yeah, there's that. Apparently, he felt like other writers had already covered that ground pretty well, and he didn't want to rehash what had already been done.
So he was being very intentional, very deliberate with what he chose to include and what he chose to leave out.
Exactly, and that brings us to the whole iceberg thing.
Ah, yes, the famous underwater part of the iceberg. What did he mean by that?
He meant that there's a whole lot more to the story than what's actually on the page. Like an iceberg, you only see the tip, but there's this massive hidden mass underneath the surface.
So all that unspoken history, all those untold stories, they're still there, informing the narrative, even if we don't see them directly.
Right, it's like the foundation that everything else is built on. It gives the story its depth and power, even though it's told in this incredibly simple, stripped-down style. It's like Hemingway's magic trick.
That's a great way to put it. So we've got this super concise writing style, this iceberg effect. How does that tie into the bigger themes Hemingway was exploring?
Well, one interesting connection is to the ending of To Have and Have Not. Remember Harry Morgan's last words?
Something about a man alone not having a chance.
Yeah, no matter how a man alone ain't got no bloody fin chance. It's this stark, kind of bleak statement about the limits of isolation.
Definitely not a feel-good ending. But how does that connect to The Old Man and the Sea?
Well, some critics see it as a thematic echo, kind of foreshadowing of the challenges Santiago faces. But there's a twist when you bring in the epigraph from For Whom the Bell Tolls.
You mean those lines from John Donne about no man is an island?
Exactly. That whole one in the many paradox, the idea that we're all connected, that each person's death diminishes us because we're part of something larger than ourselves.
A very different vibe from Harry Morgan's lonely despair.
Right. For Whom the Bell Tolls dives headfirst into that Dunnian concept, especially through the themes of war, death, and love. It's all about interconnectedness, about how our fates are intertwined. That idea that any man's death diminishes me is woven throughout the whole novel.
And the connection to Donne goes even deeper in For Whom the Bell Tolls. There's the whole Phoenix riddle and the idea of unity and love.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's what Donne's poetry comes in. He had this idea that two souls could merge into one, not through shrinking, but through expanding. It's kind of mind-blowing. And you see that mirrored in the relationship between Robert Jordan and Maria in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Even when they're physically apart, their connection is undeniable. They're basically one soul and two bodies.
Wow. So we're talking about some pretty big, complex ideas here. It's amazing how these stories can take us to these unexpected places.
It's true, and even those seemingly straightforward narratives are full of subtle touches that reinforce these deeper meanings.
Like what?
Well, think about For Whom the Bell Tolls again. There are all these little ironies sprinkled throughout the story, like Joaquin, who starts out all fired up with his revolutionary slogans, but ends up finding solace in prayer. Or Captain Mora, who thinks he's making this grand gesture of defiance, but ends up forging this unexpected bond of camaraderie with the guys he's supposed to be fighting against.
Huh. So these little moments are actually hinting at something much bigger, something about our shared humanity.
Exactly. They're like little winks from Hemingway reminding us that we're all in this together, like Dunn said, involved in mankind.
All right, so we've talked about Hemingway's writing style, his iceberg technique, and some of the bigger themes he was grappling with. Now let's focus on The Old Man and the Sea itself. What are some of the major interpretations of the story?
Well, one critic described the novel as, get this, a prose poem with a remarkably complex emotional structure focused on the different stages of a man's life.
A prose poem. That's beautiful. And it fits with Hemingway's whole idea of conveying a really powerful, almost poetic experience through his simple language.
Totally. And it's worth remembering that the story is rooted in real life. It's inspired by an actual old fisherman Hemingway knew. Yeah, so even though there's a lot of symbolism and deeper meaning at play, it's still grounded in this very real, very human experience.
That's cool. There's also this idea of the capacity for belief, even when all your illusions have been shattered. One of the sources connects that to a quote from another Hemingway novel, "Across the river and into the tree."
Oh, yeah, that's an important one. It's about how even when our dreams and expectations get crushed, even when we're faced with disappointment and loss, that basic human ability to believe in something, to find meaning in our lives, well, that's what keeps us going.
So it's not about being naive or clinging to false hope.
No, it's about something deeper than that. It's about resilience, about that inner strength that keeps it going even when things get tough. And Santiago, in his own way, he embodies that spirit. He never gives up, even when he's facing impossible odds.
He's got those mental images he uses to keep himself going, right? The boy Joe DiMaggio, that hand game.
Those are his thinkers. They represent different aspects of his strength and determination. And the critics have pointed out that the image of the boy pops up the most. It's like he's drawing strength from that connection, that sense of purpose he gets from being a mentor.
So he's got these concrete images, but there's also a lot of symbolism and paradox at play, right?
Definitely. Hemingway was a master of those things. Paradox, those seemingly contradictory ideas that actually reveal a deeper truth. He loved using those to make you think. And symbols, they're everywhere in this story, adding layers of meaning. He makes you work for it, but it's so rewarding when you start to uncover those layers.
And it's through this whole ordeal, this battle with the fish and the sharks, that Santiago goes through this really interesting transformation.
Right. It's all about his evolving understanding of pride and humility.
He starts out pretty proud, pretty confident in his abilities.
He does, but by the end, he's achieved a different kind of humility. He recognizes his limits, his place in the grand scheme of things. But that doesn't mean he's lost his pride. He still respects himself. He still knows his worth. It's a really subtle but powerful shift.
Now let's talk about one of the most popular interpretations of The Old Man and the Sea, the Christian allegory.
Yeah, that's a big one. There are definitely elements of the story that lend themselves to a Christian reading, like those 84 days Santiago goes without catching a fish. Some critics see that as a parallel to the time between Jesus' resurrection and the ascension, and his patched-up sail. It's like a symbol of his struggles, his permanent defeat in the eyes of some.
There's his physical condition, too. He's old, he's scarred, he's seen as a failure by some of the other fishermen. He doesn't even have enough to eat.
It's true. He's definitely not in great shape on the outside, but on the inside, he's still got that fire, that cheerful and undefeated spirit. It's this contrast between his external circumstances and his inner strength that really resonates with people.
And what about his prediction of catching a big fish in September?
Ah, yes. September, the time of harvest. It's like a chance for him to redeem himself, to prove that he's still got it. And those numbers, 84 days, 87 days, they hold significance in Christian numerology. They're often associated with periods of testing, of spiritual trial.
His routines, too. His solitary morning rituals, his return to the community of fishermen, those have been interpreted in a religious context, haven't they?
Absolutely. The morning ritual can be seen as his personal connection to a higher power, his way of preparing himself spiritually for the challenges ahead. And then coming back to the village, it's like rejoining the flock, being welcomed back into the fold. It reinforces this idea of a larger spiritual community that he's a part of. And the sea itself, it's almost like a representation of divine order.
But then there's his feeling that he's going far out.
Ah, that's where things get interesting. Going far out, it's like stepping outside of that established order, venturing into the unknown. It's a risk, a potential transgression. And it sets the stage for the whole drama that unfolds.
The moment he hooks the marlin is described as a passage of definition, a really crucial turning point.
It's the culmination of everything that's come before. His experience, his intuition, his deep connection to the sea. It's all led him to this moment, this encounter with this magnificent creature. But even as he's celebrating, there's this underlying sense of foreboding, a feeling that he's gone too far.
And the relationship between Santiago and the marlin, it's portrayed as something special, almost spiritual.
They're both noble creatures, each driven by their own instincts, their own need to survive. But Santiago's decision to venture far out, that's what sets the tragic events in motion. It creates this conflict, this clash of wills between these two forces of nature.
Some critics even see the stars in the story through a kind of Zantean lens.
It's interesting because Hemingway uses a lot of Dante references and islands in the stream, which one critic called the parent of the old man in the sea. So the fact that stars pop up here, it's hard to dismiss that as a coincidence. It adds this layer of cosmic significance, this sense that there's a larger order at play, watching over everything that happens.
And the killing of the marlin, it's described in pretty vivid, almost symbolic terms.
Yeah, that scene definitely packs a punch. The way the marlin leaps out of the water as it's dying, the blood, it's all very powerful, very evocative. Some critics see it as an allusion to Christ's sacrifice. Even the detail about the marlin circling the boat 3 times before it dies, that's got symbolic weight in a Christian context.
It's almost like the marlin becomes a Christ figure itself.
Right. Its struggle, its death, even its mutilation by the sharks, it all adds up to this tragic, almost martyr-like story. And Santiago, at one point, he actually sees himself and the marlin as one. They're connected on this deeper level.
And right after he catches the marlin, he starts worrying about sharks.
He knows it's coming. It's like he's aware that he's disrupted the natural order by going too far out, and now he's going to have to face the consequences.
So the sharks become the embodiment of that nemesis, the punishment for his overreaching ambition.
Exactly. They represent the inevitable backlash, the forces that restore balance. And it's all connected. Gunking too far out meant catching a bigger fish, which meant towing it for days, which gave the sharks all the time they needed to find him. It's a chain reaction, and the arrival of that first shark, it's not an accident. It's fate stepping in.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about the connections some critics have made between the old man and the sea and classical Greek tragedy.
All right, so buckle up. This one's a bit of a head scratcher. The main comparison is to Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus.
That's a Greek tragedy, right?
Yep, one of the big ones. And the parallels, they're mostly about the emotional journeys of the main characters. Both Santiago and Oedipus, they start out in a bad place, they go through a lot of suffering, but ultimately they achieve a kind of peace, a kind of spiritual triumph.
So they follow a similar arc, but was Hemingway intentionally referencing Oedipus?
Well, most critics think it's probably coincidental, like similar themes emerging from similar human experiences rather than direct imitation. But here's the funny part. Hemingway wrote another short story, A Man of the World, a few years after The Old Man and the Sea. And that story is very clearly, almost intentionally, modeled on Oedipus at Colonus.
Wow, that's wild. So maybe he was consciously playing with those classical ideas after all.
Maybe so. But let's get back to The Old Man and the Sea. That whole business with Santiago losing the marlin to the sharks after getting too far out, that's classic Greek tragedy material right there.
It's all about hubris, right? That excessive pride that leads to a hero's downfall.
Bingo. Santiago wants to prove himself, to go beyond what anyone else has done. And that ambition, that drive to push the limits, it's what ultimately leads to his loss. It's like those classic heroes, Achilles, Oedipus, they all had that same fatal flaw.
So he gets punished for his hubris. He comes back with just the skeleton of the fish.
Exactly. But even though he's lost the prize, the other fishermen still recognize him as El Campeón. They see the effort, the skill, the sheer scale of his struggle. So it's a bittersweet victory. He's been humbled, but he's still a hero in their eyes.
And then there's that last scene with the tourists and the waiter.
Oh, yeah, that's a great little moment. The tourists, they're clueless. They think the marlin skeleton is a sharp. They just don't get it. But the waiter, he understands. He sees the significance of what Santiago has accomplished.
It's like there's this secret knowledge, this deeper understanding that only certain people have access to.
Right, and it's kind of a reminder that sometimes the most important things can't be easily explained or understood by those who haven't experienced them firsthand.
Okay, let's talk about the Hemingway co-hero. What's that all about, and how does Santiago fit into that mold?
So, the Hemingway Code hero, it's not about winning or losing, it's about how you face defeat. It's about having this inner strength, this code of conduct that allows you to maintain your dignity even when everything's falling apart around you.
So it's about grace under pressure.
Exactly. It's about being stoic, about facing hardship with courage and integrity. And Santiago, he's a prime example of that. He never complains, he never gives up, even when he's suffering, and that's what makes him heroic, even though he doesn't technically win in the traditional sense.
And this code hero thing, it's not just about the characters, is it? It's reflected in Hemingway's own writing style.
Oh, absolutely. That stripped down prose, the way he cuts out all the unnecessary fluff, it's like a reflection of that code hero mentality. It's all about discipline, about precision, about getting to the heart of the matter.
So the style and the themes, they're working together to create this really powerful unified effect.
Right, and that tension between Hemingway's grand vision and his incredibly concise style, that's what makes his work so compelling. It's like he's creating beauty out of restraint, finding meaning in the face of chaos and loss.
Some critics have pointed out that Hemingway's later works felt a bit less energetic than his earlier stuff.
Yeah, there's that. Like maybe he was struggling to maintain that balance between his ambitions and his ability to execute them with the same level of precision.
Even in The Dangerous Summer, which was all about this subject he was super passionate about, it felt like something was missing.
Right. So even deep personal investment wasn't always a guarantee of success. And in Islands in the Stream, there are these moments where you can almost sense Hemingway poking fun at his own creative struggles.
Self-awareness is always good, I guess.
Definitely. But The Old Man and the Sea, it's interesting because it seems like that one flowed out of him pretty effortlessly. He even put aside other projects to work on it. It's almost like this story had a life of its own.
Now let's talk about Islands in the Stream. How does that book, written at a different point in Hemingway's career, compare to The Old Man and the Sea?
Well, one way to look at it is to compare similar episodes. In The Old Man and the Sea, you've got Santiago catching the marlin. And in Islands in the Stream, there's this scene where David Hudson tries to catch a broadbill swordfish.
And how do those two scenes compare?
Well, they both involve these epic struggles against these powerful fish, but the way they're presented is very different. Santiago's story, it's very self-contained, almost fable-like. It takes place in this kind of timeless, allegorical space. But in Islands in the Stream, that scene with the broadbill, it's embedded in this much larger, more complex narrative. There's a whole web of characters and backstories and social contexts that inform that moment.
So Islands in the Stream is more of a traditional novel, while The Old Man and the Sea is more like a myth or a parable.
Right. And Islands in the Stream, even though it was heavily edited after Hemingway died, it still manages to hold together pretty well. Each of the three parts focuses on different aspects of decline and loss.
It's a pretty bleak book, isn't it?
It can be. The main character, Thomas Hudson, he's this artist who's kind of lost his way. He's haunted by his past. He's struggling to connect with people. And he often feels powerless to change the things happening around him. It's a pretty unflinching look at the darker side of human nature.
And Hemingway wasn't shy about putting himself into that book.
Not at all. He basically lifted whole chunks of his own life and put them right into the story. His wives, his sons, his friends, even his cat, they're all in there, barely disguised, like that scene with the pig suicide. That was based on something that actually happened when Hemingway was in Cuba with his sons.
So he was blurring the lines between fiction and autobiography.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder how much of himself he poured into his other characters, too.
Speaking of blurring lines, let's talk about the whole feminine identifications thing and how the sea is gendered in The Old Man and the Sea.
Okay, so this is where things get a little tricky. There's this tendency in American literature, especially from a male perspective, to see nature as feminine, as this nurturing, life-giving force.
Mother Nature and all that.
Right, and in The Old Man and the sea is often referred to as la mar, which is feminine in Spanish. But it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
How so?
Well, the sea is definitely presented as powerful and life-giving, but it's also dangerous, unpredictable, even cruel at times. And one critic pointed out that when a female character in a critical essay focuses too much on the aesthetic beauty of Santiago's struggle, it kind of diminishes the tragic weight of his experience.
Interesting. So maybe there's a gender difference in how that struggle is perceived and valued.
Maybe so. And then you've got this really provocative statement from one critic: to be American is male. And the quintessential American experience is a betrayal by a woman.
Wow, that's a bold statement. How does that connect to the old man and the sea?
Well, it's not directly related to Santiago's relationship with the sea or Manilin, but it raises some interesting questions about the whole American mythology of masculinity and how women are often portrayed in relation to that. It makes you think about the deeper cultural forces at play.
And some critics have pushed back against this whole idea of nature being inherently feminine and passive.
Right, like who gets to define nature that way, and what are the implications of that definition, especially when you consider the historical reality of women being excluded from land ownership and control. It's a really important critique of that dominant male perspective.
And then there's this whole American myth about civilization threatening Adamic innocence, living in harmony with nature.
Yeah, that's a classic. And one critic argues that this myth often serves to mask the realities of economic exploitation and environmental destruction. It's like a way of romanticizing our relationship with nature while ignoring the ways we're harming it.
So how does all of this apply to the gendering of the sea and the old man and the sea?
Well, it's interesting that the younger fishermen, the ones who are more focused on technology and profit, they refer to the sea as El Mar, the masculine form. It's like they see it as a competitor, an adversary to be conquered.
But Santiago and the older fishermen use Lamar.
Exactly. And that subtle linguistic difference, it actually reveals a lot. It suggests a different kind of relationship with the sea, one based on respect, understanding, even love.
Like they're acknowledging the sea's power and its feminine aspects.
Right. And it's interesting that they bring in the version of Cobra, the patron saint of Cuba, into this whole discussion.
How so?
Well, she's this really complex figure, a representation of the eternal feminine, and she's closely linked to the sea, especially in the Cuban context.
It's like she embodies that connection between humanity and the natural world.
And John Steinbeck had a really interesting perspective on the version of Loreto, which is another version of the Virgin Mary. He saw her not just as a religious figure, but as a kind of ecological force, a symbol of that ancient bond between humans and nature that goes back way before Christianity.
So it's like she transcends religious boundaries.
Exactly. And then you've got Rachel Carson, the marine biologist who wrote Silent Spring. She had this really powerful scientific perspective on the Mother Sea. She talked about how all life on Earth originated in the ocean and how even our own blood is chemically similar to seawater.
It's amazing when you think about it like that.
It is, and Santiago, he clearly has this kind of mythic understanding of the sea. He sees it as powerful feminine force, a goddess who obeys the cycles of the moon.
There's so much depth to this whole idea of how we gender the natural world. And it adds a whole new layer of meaning to the story.
Definitely. And one student even suggested that Santiago's sin, his act of killing the marlin, might actually stem from a moment where he slips into that masculine way of thinking.
How so?
Well, by seeing the marlin as a competitor to be conquered, he's kind of betraying his own deeper, more feminine-coded philosophy of respect for the sea. It's like a momentary lapse in judgment that leads to this tragic consequence.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking interpretation. Now let's dive into some of the psychological readings of Santiago's character.
All right, so get ready for this one. Some critics argue that Santiago, even though he's often seen as this almost saintly figure, he actually has a pretty significant aggressive side. Like, it's not just about his battles with the sharks. It's also evident in his past, like that arm wrestling match he won back in his younger days. It's like he's always had this competitive drive, this need to prove himself.
But what about that story Manilin tells about the boated greedfish? That was pretty reckless of Santiago.
It was, and some critics see that as a sign of Santiago's hidden aggression, his willingness to put others at risk to satisfy his own needs.
And he doesn't even apologize to Manilin for it.
Nope, and that's seen as either a lack of remorse or maybe a belief that apologizing would be a sign of weakness. Like, it would be unmanly to admit he was wrong.
He also makes some pretty sexist comments.
Yeah, that's true. The way he talks about the Portuguese man-of-war jellyfish, calling it a whore, and his assumptions about female marlin being more prone to panic, it all points to this underlying aggression towards women.
Which is kind of ironic, considering his deep respect for the marlin, which she sees as feminine.
Totally, it's like he's got this complicated relationship with the feminine.
And even his seemingly innocent comment about washing his hands before eating, that's been interpreted as a form of passive aggression.
Yeah, like he's subtly making Manilin feel guilty for not being more attentive to his needs.
And Manilin's excessive kindness towards Santiago is seen as a way of compensating for that guilt.
Right, it's like a cycle of manipulation, even if Santiago isn't fully aware of it.
Some critics even suggest that Santiago's constant generosity towards Manilin is a way of masking his own deeper, more aggressive impulses.
Yeah, like it's a form of reaction formation. He's overcompensating for his own darker feelings by being overly kind.
It's a pretty dark interpretation.
It is, and it gets even darker when you consider the idea that Santiago's passive role during the fight with the marlin, just holding the line, is actually a form of aggression.
How so?
Well, by refusing to actively engage, by just letting the marlin wear itself out, he's kind of inflicting pain and suffering on it. And Manolin, by being there, by witnessing it all, he's also being subjected to that aggression, even if it's not directed at him specifically.
And what about Manolin's sudden assertiveness at the end of the book?
That's seen as him acting out Santiago's repressed aggression. It's like he's expressing the anger that Santiago himself can't or won't express.
So even that final heartwarming conversation between them is seen as being tainted by these darker undercurrents.
Right. The way Santiago uses pronouns to downplay his own role in losing the marlin, his casualness about the marlin's head and spear, it's all interpreted as manipulation.
And his seemingly innocent questions to Manolin are seen as veiled attempts to control him, to make him feel inadequate.
It's a pretty bleak view of their relationship.
It is. But it makes you think. So the takeaway from this psychological reading is that Santiago is a pretty complex, even troubled character.
Definitely. He's not just this wise old saint. He's got his flaws, his demons, and he's not always aware of the impact he's having on others.
Let's switch gears again and talk about the Taoist interpretation of the Old Man and the Sea.
All right, time for some Eastern philosophy. So, Taoism, it's all about the Tao, which is this fundamental force that flows through everything in the universe. It's the source of all being, but it's also constantly changing, constantly in flux.
It's like the yin and yang symbol.
Exactly. It's about balance, about the interplay of opposites. And the key to living a good life, according to Taoism, is to align yourself with the Tao, to go with the flow, to accept the natural order of things.
So how does that apply to Santiago?
Well, his world is full of these dualities. The sea is both life-giving and destructive. The marlin is both his brother and his prey. And Santiago himself is both strong and vulnerable, wise and foolish.
So it's not about picking sides, about being good or bad, winning or losing.
Nope. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything, the constant interplay of light and dark, creation and destruction.
And the Taoist concept of fasting of the heart, how does that fit into all of this?
So fasting of the heart, it's about emptying yourself of desires and expectations, about cultivating a state of openness and receptivity to whatever comes your way. It's about letting go of control, about surrendering to the Tao.
That makes sense. And Santiago, when he loses the marlin to the sharks, he doesn't really freak out.
Right. He accepts it. He doesn't blame the sharks. He doesn't wallow in self-pity. He just acknowledges that it's part of the natural order of things.
So it's not about seeing it as a defeat.
Nope. It's about recognizing the cycle, the ebb and flow of life and death. The marlin was caught, it lived, it died, it nourished other creatures. It's all part of the Tao.
And Santiago, even though he loses the marlin, he still goes back out to sea.
He does, and that's a really important point, because it shows that he hasn't lost his spirit, his connection to the sea. He's not defined by that one experience. He's still a fisherman. He's still living in harmony with the Tao.
And what about the ending, where Santiago is sleeping peacefully while Manolin is crying?
That's a beautiful moment because it shows that Santiago has achieved a level of understanding that Manolin hasn't reached yet. He's moved beyond the emotions of victory and defeat. He's at peace with the way things are.
It's a very different way of looking at it.